Welcome, talofa lava, kia orana, whakaloa lahi atu, nisa bulavanaka, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So we couldn't have a better topic really as we head into the holiday season. And so we thought this is a really great opportunity right now to shine a light on what tourism could look like after COVID. And certainly we've heard it from many of our Pacific colleagues that we cannot afford to waste the crisis of COVID. This is our chance to really think about what tourism could be post-COVID and how it can be rebuilt back better for those communities in the Pacific. So I first, it was my great pleasure to introduce the speakers, done some phenomenally useful and impactful research on exactly this topic. So first of all, Dr. Api Movono, who is a senior lecturer at Massey, and Api specialises in Pacific development, but shining a light on how can it be sustainable, how can it benefit communities, and with a particular focus on tourism. And of course, we've got Regina Scheyvens, who will be known to many of you, Professor of Development Studies at Massey University, who has spent many years researching tourism in the Pacific. So the work that these two have done together is quite phenomenal, and I think it will have a real practical impact on what happens post-COVID. And one of the things about COVID is that it's allowed some really positive trends to happen more quickly. And there's a sense of urgency that this is our chance to really make a difference. Also, both Regina and Api have just published a book called Mana of the Pacific, which is based on Pacific proverbs, which of course links back to how it is that the Pacific communities in the Pacific have managed the resilience that they've shown through the COVID period. And that, of course, informs what tourism will look like post-COVID. So also then we're going to hear from Eliza Raymond, who runs the amazing organisation Good Travel, who's a CID member. She's the co-founder of it and will be known to many of you in the sector. And it's a lovely way to tie it up, because Eliza's focus will of course be on how is it that as New Zealanders we can go to the Pacific and be good tourists. What does good tourism look like from the perspective of the person being the tourist? And she really is out to transform the tourist industry from our perspective. So welcome the three of you, and wonderful to hear from you. And I'll hand over now to Api and Regina to start the talk, and then we'll go to Eliza. So kia ora both.
Kia ora, Josie, and thanks for that lovely introduction. We're delighted to be here today to talk to you all. And Nisa Bulavanaka, of course, Fiji is the only place that officially has opened for tourism at the moment, and Cook Islands is opening in the middle of January, so there's going to be some interesting possibilities in the months ahead. We want to share with you some of our research today. Api's just taking a moment to get our slides that were just here before have disappeared for a moment, so we're just going to find those and get them up on the screen. I want to remind you that before we had this sorry, that's distracting. But prior to the pandemic hitting and everybody being super worried about there being too little tourism, were concerns about too much tourism. So this cartoon's obviously from Hawaii, and depicts a scene where there's obviously suggesting there's some concerns about tourists returning, and it's important for us to realise that some of those same concerns exist in the Pacific, in the South Pacific as well, but also that there were concerns even prior to the pandemic about sometimes there being over-tourism, negative impacts on people and their environments. So let's try and get it right for the future is what we're thinking of. And if there's one quote that we've had from our interviewees which encapsulates the main message that we'd be trying to get across, it's this one from a Fijian elder who said that tourism must complement our way of life. So since May 2020, Api, who joined us in the Development Studies program at Massey in February 2020, we were worried. We were in lockdown and we were worried about the communities we'd been doing research with for a long time, looking into how tourism was impacting on their lives, how they were engaging with tourism and so forth. So we knew we had to keep this going during the pandemic period. So since then, we've been collecting data through a range of means. And the main questions we're asking is, how has it impacted particularly on Indigenous people involved in tourism? How have they responded to the pandemic? And how could more sustainable, self-determined forms of tourism be developed post-pandemic, especially linked to supporting Indigenous wellbeing? And we've done the research primarily across 5 countries. There was a survey that went out on via social media last year, so that went out online. And then we employed research associates in 5 countries, as indicated on the map here, last year to collect some data. We're following this up this year with further data collection, focusing on the 4 countries that are more dependent on tourism income: Cook Islands, Samoa, Fiji, and Vanuatu. And it's important to know that there's a wellbeing dimension to our research. We're actually at the moment collecting data from various countries on what are measuring wellbeing prior to the return of tourism, and then we're going to follow that up in 6 months' time to see how their wellbeing has changed 6 months after the return of tourism. And that's got 6 types of wellbeing that we're measuring, and that's going to have some quantitative and qualitative data. So we'll be reporting on that in the future. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that Api in particular has done ethnographic research for over 10 years and in a particular community. So we've really been able to keep our finger on the pulse through Api's continuous conversations with people in that community about what's happening with tourism. But we've also had these research associates on the ground. And this shows you who most of them are, and we also have a couple of others to add into the mix who haven't sent us their profiles yet, but they've been really important people who we've been working with to be able to do in-depth interviews. In the survey we did last year, we found that around 58% of our respondents were employees of tourism. Another 27% owned their own businesses that were tourism businesses or closely related, such as a taxi service, and 15% were neither. That 15% were very relevant to our research though too, because we were targeting tourism dependent communities. That was the common denominator for all of the places where the data was collected. So obviously people who are living in a community like around the Muri Beach area in Rarotonga, where some of you may have been, all of them would be impacted by tourism, whether or not they're directly involved in owning a business or working in tourism or not. Also important to note, over 40% of our respondents had worked in tourism for over 10 years, and that's quite significant. So they were long-term employees. So this pandemic's impacted on them a lot. They worked in a range of different roles, from receptionists through to event planners and finance people, through to tour guides. So all sorts. And the direct economic impact was really harsh, is what they were telling us. So almost 60% of respondents lived in households that prior to the pandemic relied for tourism for over 50% of their household income. So remember too that of the countries we're looking at, those 5 countries that were indicated on the earlier map, only one of them had a wage subsidy scheme in place, and that was Cook Islands. The rest of them had no wage subsidy scheme. There have been some small supports, but nothing consistent and significant for them. So it's been really tough in that way financially. So in fact, 73% of our respondents to this survey last year in 2020 told us that they'd experienced a major decline in their earnings. How does this link to this Mana of the Pacific book that Josie mentioned at the start? So this just came out a few weeks ago, and essentially it's a book of whakatauki or proverbs from 20 different cultural groups around the Pacific and matched with photographs, quite beautiful photographs, 3/4 of which are from Pedram Pernia's collection. Many of you who are online now will know Pedram through his work in the NGO sector, and also from my brother Henry Scheyvens, some photographs from him. But so it's basically modelled on the same approach that the book Mauri Ora took, which many of you may be familiar with as well. It came out in 2016. So we've published this book of inspirational proverbs about themes like resilience, perseverance, communal solidarity, leadership, because these are all characteristics that we saw coming out very strongly in communities that were adapting quite effectively to life without tourism, that had found ways of managing. So I'm handing over to Api now, who's going to be sharing with you some of what we've found. And we weave into our talk some of the proverbs from Mana of the Pacific.
Yeah, so part of the inspiration for the book came about because of how adaptive people were. And we felt, look, there was a need to highlight this, but also in a way, try to experiment on a resilience finance platform. So the book and all its proceeds will go back to support the people that we are conducting research in, the communities, but also to support in the process of resilience. And I'll take you through the next slides, which really just matches up and gives you an idea of how people are actually dealing with the pandemic. A lot of us have watched news videos, social media posts of how people everywhere have struggled, but there's people in the Pacific are no exception. But despite their many struggles, despite losing their major source of income, women's group are coming together. People are developing micro enterprises. Former tourism workers are developing catering businesses. Former hotel groundskeepers start up their own landscaping businesses, and so on and so forth. So these effective adaptations of income really speaks to one of the quotes in the book, which comes from the Federated States of Micronesia, the Chuukese language, Ramas Chok Angang, which means people must work together to accomplish great tasks, and that collective action is better than individual action. And this sense of communal solidarity came through quite strongly in those communities that were adapting to the sudden loss of tourism income. Others are based on utilizing the land and sea to grow and harvest food. One former Samoan tourism worker, young man, said, look, like our family, everyone else has gone back to the land. For some things, I've had to relearn skills that have not been used for years, skills in planting, and especially fishing. And on top of that, they openly express their happiness of the variety of crops that they now grow, and also the different skills that they've learned during the pause brought about by border closures. Here's another proverbs that speaks to this type of adaptation or these behaviors that we're seeing. And this comes from the Sentani language in Papua. Hamang nanai sele, eme rubuya hele mende. Food does not come automatically, only from working hard. If you work diligently in your gardens and plantations, you will not go hungry. And this spirit of diligence really shone through for people who lived in the urban areas, turning to various forms of small micro enterprises, increasing their entrepreneurial activities, but also really assessing what resources they have, what resources they had, and utilizing it, and really working diligently in your gardens, not to grow hungry. And we found this not surprising, but quite amazing to see that despite losing all your only source of income, people still had the ability, the knowledge, and the resources to sustain themselves and their families, which is quite quite amazing, I reckon. Bartering also became more prominent, and some of you may have seen the BBC and CNN articles of how people were bartering pigs for kayaks, bartering groceries for in exchange for services, and so on and so forth. And there was an explosion of social media groups, Barter for Better Fiji, Barter for Better Honiara, Barter for Better Vanuatu, and so on and so forth. So, and again, these are not new mediums of exchange for people in the Pacific. It's just throughout the crisis, they re-engaged in these forms of exchanges where without cash, you can still sustain and get resources that you may need. So one of our proverbs in the books comes from the Fijian language, which goes like this: Mateo valendua, mbulo valerua. And it's a saying that our elders always remind us of, to always have two gardens. Having two gardens is better than one, because if one dies, the other lives to feed us. And for those of us who are working in the development space and appreciate the value of sustainable livelihoods, this knowledge, it's very old, but yet very relevant, not just for today, but in facing future uncertainties. So this sense of preparedness to have diverse livelihoods activities rather than placing all your eggs in one basket. Perhaps tourism in Fiji can learn a few things from its own proverbs, right? There was also a notable rise in communal gifting and sharing of surplus crops and fish. Respondents from Samoa would say, look, we realize that we've lost so much time away from our family for caring for each other. When we have surplus, we make sure we go to others within the community who don't have those. And in Fiji, similarly, and in other parts of the Pacific, where people just realized, appreciated their obligation, their duty to each other in the community. And this also led on to improvements in other forms of well-being and happiness. This is, I mean, I could say this for all the whakatokis in the book, they're all my favorites. But this is one from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Kandrik fan yokwe dik. A little bit of food, a little love. Even if you have just a little bit of food, share it. And again, you know, this theme comes across, despite having so little and despite having suffered so much, that inner conscience, that Pacific spirit of sharing and working together and caring have come through quite strongly in the results of our research. Here's another one from Samoa. O nei ayo au, tayo au, o au nei ayo tayo. And please forgive my my pronunciation. My grandmother always told me, look, Fijians have shorter tongues than your Polynesian rivals. So you may not be able to pronounce your language quite simply. But what it means is today it's your turn, but tomorrow it will be my turn. I may not have what I need today, but I know that you will look after me. In turn, I will support you in time of need. And so this sense of reciprocity is clear, and people know deep down that one good turn will always generate another. And this really builds into the systems of resilience that we can tap on and strengthen to improve preparedness and diversify livelihood opportunities.
Just one comment on this slide, because any of you who are from the Pacific or know the Pacific can obviously tell that this is not an image from Samoa. This image is from Vanuatu. You can pick that up straight away. Okay, that's intentional in Mana of the Pacific. We were trying to build a sense of unified values that run across countries and cultures in the Pacific. And indeed, we found this in many cases. People might have submitted the same proverbs to this proverb competition that we ran, the same meaning, but in several different languages. And we were trying to get a selection of them. And we also had to rely on photo archives because we couldn't send anyone to travel out among the islands. So we had to rely on the photos that we already had. But we wanted to build a sense of, it's not just that this proverb only relates to Samoa. It relates across the Pacific, and there are variations thereof in many other places as well.
So this unified approach that we took was intentional also because there was a unified response. Although it came in different languages, the themes were quite clear. And in the practices that people were engaging in. Solsolowakio communal labor. This is, assisting the community with no expectation of reward, has also grown as an adept strategy. And Fijian proverb, Solsolowaki said the Kelendovata, people are telling us, respondents, participants, and people who did our survey affirmed that unity is firmly established when people work together to achieve common goals. And for specific communities where they really came together, there were much better outcomes for them. There was a common theme of safety, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling happy, feeling content, because people are working together.
So then, even though, like we indicated, financial well-being had clearly declined, and this is a measure from our 2020 survey when we looked at 4 types of well-being. As I mentioned, we've got a current survey which has added on environmental and spiritual well-being as 2 further ones. But financial well-being here clearly declined for most people. But mental, social, and physical well-being was far more mixed. For some people, it declined a bit. For other people, it improved during the pandemic period. And I think the proverbs that quotes we've shown you really indicate that very clearly. When we look at then what it means for people's aspirations for the future of tourism, how do they want to enhance their own well-being? Well, they'd like better job security, wages, and working conditions. It's been pretty tough. Api, remind me the minimum wage in Fiji and what quite a few people in the tourism sector are paid. $2.68. Okay, $2.68 Fijian. So maybe that's $1.70 New Zealand or $1.80 New Zealand now. Training. They want more opportunities to get those transferable skills. So then if there's any future shocks that hit tourism, and we know there will be, the pandemic is the current one, but we know it's going to be cyclones, or it's going to be floods, or it's going to be a political crisis, or another economic crisis. All of these things hit tourism hard. So how can they have some more transferable skills? Like greater ownership of their own businesses rather than mainly working in the businesses of others. And that was quite a strong theme. They need to be supported to be able to get those businesses off the ground. And there need to be better loans than the commercial loans with 20% interest rates, which make it very tough for someone to start their own business. Shared ownership models for larger properties was something they talked about a lot, especially in countries like Fiji. In Cook Islands, joint ventures are mandated basically for if I, as a Palangi, want to run a tourism enterprise there, it's only going to happen if there's majority Cook Islands ownership of it. In Fiji, of course, that's not the case. People also talked about wanting to lessen the burden on over-touristed areas and spread the benefits to develop tourism to outer islands, new locations, and also promote off-season tourism. You might see that this is something that's been discussed here in Aotearoa as well. So some of those places that were hotspots for tourism, but that had experienced over-tourism pre-pandemic, they're saying, listen, we need to do things differently. And we don't really want that over-tourism occurring. Ultimately, people wanted balance. The flexible or part-time employment really helped. They wanted time for their families. They wanted time for their gardens, for fishing. They know that the skills they've developed during the pandemic period, or that they've relearned during the pandemic period, such as to do with fishing and gardening, are ones that they can fall back on any time when there's a crisis in future. So they want time to maintain those great gardens that they've been building. So if we look at what matters to them, just 3 proverbs that bring it together, Api can take you through those and wrap up before we pass on to Eliza then.
So we'll share one now from Tuvalu. Ulu ki te whatu e malu e koe. Shelter in the rock for your safety. It is important to protect one's culture as the foundation of identity. And this really supports one of our respondents from Fiji, Fijian elder, who said, tourism must complement our way of life. It must not take over it. And it's this way of life that people want to protect, having enough time to spend with your family and nurture these relationships and transfer knowledge and culture. Papua New Guinea, in the Bena Bena language, if you plant a tree, look after it well. It will then give you good fruit. Take care of your children and raise them well. They will bring pride to your family and many benefits. So really, the future and the resilience of Pacific peoples is entwined and interconnected with their culture. And so maintaining these cultures and maintaining the processes that allow people to transfer these knowledges is very important. Kinship and culture. From Tokelau, o he tifa, o he tifa. Behold, a mother of pearl, a mother of pearl. A good mother is like a mother of pearl shell. Just as the shell protects and nurtures the precious pearl, so a mother cares for a child. And for those of us who in the tourism space, we know that majority of workers are female. And in the Pacific, they are hardest workers. They are frontline. They leave home very early in the morning. They miss out quality time with their families to put food on the table. And if we're talking about tourism complementing our way of life, then we should definitely consider the needs of our mothers and our sisters and our people who work in space. So if you are keen to know more about the research that we are doing and which we'll be doing, we have our own website where we make accessible all the findings of our research, and you're welcome to visit and maybe share it with your contacts if you find it interesting.
We also publish in short form articles, like if you're not really keen on reading the 20 to 25 page versions, and 800 words is doable though, the 5-minute read. We've published a few things in the conversation and also the good travel blogs. So those are places where you can get nice little snapshots of some of our key findings to make them more accessible. And here's our final proverb to finish off with, and then we'll hand over to Eliza.
Ele se ua, e to'o ai. The rain will stop, no storm lasts forever. There will be challenges in life, but the tough times will pass. And to conclude, the man of the Pacific people encourage us to persevere. Whatever storms have come and gone, pandemics will come and go, Pacific people will continue to persevere and will be resilient going forward. Vinaka for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Kia ora koroa. That was wonderful, both of you. Thank you so much. And I think there's nothing there that New Zealanders right across the country wouldn't identify with. That want better job security, training for transferable skills when a crisis hits. There's so much that actually we can learn from the Pacific. More local ownership of businesses, of opportunities. So this is the way we should talk about development to New Zealanders, because they get that. It's how our families function too. So the fact that you've captured that with data and analysis is just wonderful. It's so useful for us going forward about how we talk about development. I just wondered, before we go over to Eliza, if anybody wants to ask a question or a comment quickly, and then we'll go to Eliza and you'll have more time for questions then. But any couple of quick thoughts or questions?
We've seen the ones in the chat just now, and Mana of the Pacific is available in Whipcool's Paper Plus Unity, and you can buy it online otherwise from the publishers, Potton and Burton, who are based in Nelson. and are electric ferries and those forms of sustainable transport part of the future? Absolutely. We do need to look at more sustainable means of transport. It's not only what happens on the ground, it's how we're getting people there and how we're moving them around. And there has been some promise in terms of Susanna Becken does some really nice work on aviation and sustainable aviation. And for short haul, it's looking more electric planes are looking more promising than the longer distance. The catering and landscaping?
Yeah, catering and landscaping. This is your question, Nigel. Well, during the pandemic, it's the property owners that employ these people. It's people who are in the middle working class bracket, civil servants who engage the services of these people. And as you know, Pacific Island people, we have a very healthy appetite. And so you can't go wrong with the catering business, right? There's always a feast or a birthday or a wedding or something that will require someone to cook some good kai. So
yeah, Ben's Kitchen.
Ben's
It's been
Kitchen.
A great example. Yeah. That's on Facebook. So Ben was a resort chef, lost his job, started up a Facebook page, started catering, and now there's branches in a number of major towns in Fiji and the diaspora. The Fijian diaspora will order the Father's Day pack, $250 to be delivered to their families and so forth on Father's Day, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So quite a lot of innovation going on in the entrepreneurial space that it would be great for some NGOs and others to look at building upon too.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because if you look at literature on Indigenous entrepreneurship in Fiji in particular, in some parts of the Pacific just 5 years ago, there was, these excuses of why these businesses fail. And yet in a crisis, you see blossoming and flourishing micro enterprises. And so, this is some of the other outcomes for us.
Mm-hmm. Api, that's true. We've heard that from our colleagues in Piango as well. They're saying there's been this emergence of entrepreneurs for people, ex-flight attendants as well, not just people sort of directly in tourism that are setting up small businesses. And so they're asking us, how can our members support scaling up some of these micro businesses? So we're hearing that a lot. Phil, you've got a quick question, which is a good one. Do you want to talk to it? And then we'll go to Eliza.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, great stuff, guys. This is very interesting. I'm not really involved in the tourism side of development and aid at all, but there's a lot of offshoots from it, particularly in Fiji. So a couple of questions. Firstly, people who work in the land, or those who have access to land. As we know, not everyone has access to land in Fiji and in other Pacific countries, but those who have, are they mainly to feed themselves and their households? Or is it with an eye to small business, setting up and selling at markets or to local communities and actually make that a sustainable business, perhaps? I'm also very interested in the tourism operator perspective. We talked about a new way of reimagining. You talked well about reimagining, re-entering the tourism industry. I can't help but think, as a past employer, though, how some employees and the large ones may want to sort of bend things more to be beneficial to them, to protect themselves for future shocks. And therefore have perhaps things in place that are more to benefit them than the employees. So what's the process? Did you talk to many tourism operators in the process about re-entering people and local people into the workforce? I have other questions, but that'll do for the moment. Thanks very much.
Good questions, Phil.
Maybe I can answer the first part, and then Regina can share a bit about Ani and the good work they're doing at Paradise Pacific Resorts. So what happened, in the early parts of the pandemic, when it first struck, people were mainly left in despair. So the technique was to try and sustain themselves. So they took to gardening, planting, farming, working together in community groups. But then as the amount of time increased, they also increased their production. So some of them ventured on to sell surplus, to share, to barter. So with some communities in the Coral Coast that were planting and fishing, they were bartering with their relatives and kin in the upperlands who were able to then barter what they were making. or exchange what they were making. I recently had a conversation with one of our RAs who said, look, we've been doing all this planting, we're well fed. The issue now for us is on value adding this produce and making sure that it doesn't go to waste. Where our development partners here, or government or marketing development authority, to make sure that they carry out this surplus and it doesn't go to waste. Because for us, the focus has been on building volume. And so maybe we can have a bit more to talk about at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tourism employers one, we were interested in all cases, as you see from our research questions, particularly on the impacts and the responses of Indigenous people, and some of them were owners of resorts and some of them were not. And so we have spoken to some owners, and there are some great examples of those that have been bending over backwards to support their employees. Think of the Cook Islands. Annie Thompson's a good example at Pacific Resorts. They own 3 resorts, I think, and she's the manager there. And she also wrote a blog called For Good Travel blog about what they're doing after we'd interviewed her, because it was so inspirational. They were doing so much to look after the well-being of their employees during the COVID period. So like I said earlier, they had a wage subsidy, which really helped with a baseline income for people. But they were doing heaps of different cross training at the resort and different parts of it, giving people the opportunity to develop new skills, but also cross-training literally in terms of running lots of exercise programs for their staff, keeping people motivated, getting little social competitions going among the staff, not just for the staff though too. When they would run an exercise class, anybody from the community could come in and participate, and they said quite often there'd be a few of the older grannies coming just to watch and laugh and applaud from time to time at who could lift the weights or do the stuff or do the good moves. And they really did marvelous stuff to keep up their staff morale. But Cook Islands is a particular case in point. They've also lost at least 1,000 to 2,000 often young workers who have come to Aotearoa New Zealand to work through RSE or in freezing works, etc. at this time because of their long duration without tourism income. So they're actually a bit short-staffed in the tourism sector, which is going to be tough for them. So there's different issues in every country. What we didn't want, though, was an idea that we should just return to business as usual and those employees should feel really lucky to have any sort of job and accept any sort of conditions. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what emerges in the future in terms of who is going to look after the well-being of their employees.
Thanks, Regina. And a perfect segue to talk now to Eliza from Good Travel, who will talk about how as New Zealanders we can be good tourists in the Pacific. So Eliza, welcome.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you, Regina and Api. It's such a privilege to talk after you and hopefully build on what you've talked about and relate it to us all as individual travellers. And many of us, I'm sure, starting to dream about travelling again and travelling to the Pacific. So let me share my slides here. So as Josie mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Good Travel, which is a social enterprise based here in Wellington, but working globally since 2013 to offer good trips. And we are an all-women organisation co-founded by 4 women from 4 continents. I'm also in the process of co-founding the Good Travel Foundation, which will be a New Zealand charitable trust. And we'll be specialising in tourism education and research with a focus on New Zealand and the Pacific. And I can see my 2 other co-founders, Debbie and Josie, are here today. So thanks for joining you too. And our shared vision between Good Travel and the Good Travel Foundation is essentially to transform the tourism industry into a force for good. And the definition of good is, of course, constantly evolving and developing as situations change as we learn more. But essentially, we have a vision for a tourism industry where travellers can make informed decisions that drive positive change, where our planet is not only protected but regenerated, where opportunities for access into the tourism industry are equitable for everyone, where tourism experiences are designed so that global citizenship is cultivated, and where we support host communities to thrive. And if we zoom in onto that last point there, I think this quote from Michelle Holliday, who we interviewed on our Good Awaits podcast, really summarizes what we're talking about. So she said that we're starting to ask for community well-being as the primary deliverable of tourism. And really, why would you do it otherwise? Why would you invite people over if what you're left with is a worse condition than when they first arrived? So then if we try to bring that sense of tourism as an opportunity to uplift community well-being into the Pacific context, I want to draw on this beautiful Frangipani framework, which I take no credit for. This is the work of Api and Regina and their colleague Sophie Okram, and is the result of the work that they have just been talking about in terms of the survey and the interviews that they did in 5 Pacific countries. And so as they were looking at how the COVID-19 border closures have impacted the well-being of Pacific people, they've come up with these different petals and elements of well-being. And so I thought this would be a great way to talk about what it means to be a good traveller in the Pacific. How can we contribute positively towards these different elements of well-being? So I'm going to go through each petal of the Frangipani flower with you now. So if we start with financial well-being, which is often what we're talking about in a tourism industry context. As Regina talked about, the COVID-19 pandemic has of course caused a lot of financial hardship and insecurity in the Pacific, but returning to business as usual is not what people want. They want tourism to return, the majority, but as she said, they want better wages, better job security, and better working conditions. So as travellers, we need to spend our money mindfully when we travel and look at who we're supporting through our dollars. So where are we staying? What tours are we doing? Are they locally owned and run businesses? Are they businesses at the forefront of sustainable and regenerative tourism in the Pacific? And be willing to pay more for our experiences. A lot of COVID-19 protocols come at a cost, so we may be paying more than we're used to, and being willing to tip and uplift those low minimum wages. And of course, traveling off season and traveling beyond the tourist trail. So then onto the petal of social well-being. So as Regina and Api spoke about, many people in the Pacific have felt that COVID has allowed them to spend more time with family. And again, that beautiful quote that tourism must complement our way of life rather than taking over. So as visitors, again, supporting locally owned and operated tourism businesses where staff are from the nearby village, as opposed to some of the larger multinational resorts where staff are required to travel long distances from home and often live on site at the resort, meaning that they can't see their families for long periods, particularly in high season. Spend time with local people, get to know them, but also respect their time and recognize that people are busy and have lives beyond serving you as a visitor. And of course, respecting and celebrating local cultures and languages. One of the really interesting findings from Regina and Api's work was around spiritual well-being and the positive impact of the pandemic on spirituality, and really how it's given people time to devote to their spirituality, but also enact spirituality through service to others, and this idea of reciprocity that Api talked about. So this is kind of an interesting one, probably the one I found most challenging to link to what our role is as visitors. But I think there's certainly a role for us to play in terms of respecting and celebrating local spirituality, but also using this as an opportunity to really listen and learn from the people that we spend time with and allowing our assumptions to be challenged. This photo I've shared here is actually from a good travel trip we did to Fiji. And through all good travel trips, we include a donation of US $100 per traveller, which goes to a local project which our local partner identifies. And in this particular case, they asked for our donation to go towards renovations of the village church and for us to spend our day of volunteering and cleaning the church. And we were quite unsure of what to do. In the beginning, this wasn't the usual type of project that we would support, but we did do it. And actually it was a fantastic way to spend the day with the community on something that they really wanted to be doing. And so we all got involved and did it together. So it was very different to kind of a traditional volunteerism experience where visitors are perhaps coming in to impart their expertise or try to save the world in a day. It was very much working alongside the community and having a lot of fun doing something that was meaningful for them. Then the petal of mental well-being. So of course, Api and Regina found that there was anxiety and stress that had been caused by the financial struggles resulting from the pandemic. But at the same time, they found people were expressing feelings of happiness, of less stress, and feeling more connected with their communities. So as we think again about traveling to the Pacific, how can we positively support the mental well-being of the people that we interact with? So for sure, we need to slow down and be more patient, more flexible, and more grateful in our interactions with host communities. And essentially remember that our hosts are people with families and lives outside of their jobs. So take time to ask people how they're doing and to recognize how in some ways the pandemic has given us different challenges, but in many ways we face very similar challenges across cultures. So I think there's an opportunity there to share and connect through those challenges as well. And then the final petal was around physical well-being. And Api talked a little bit about how the pandemic had allowed people to have more time for fishing and farming and returning to their land, and more time to prepare meals as well. And so there had been some positive effects on physical well-being. So again, this is kind of an interesting one to try and relate to travelers, but I think there is an opportunity for us as travelers to recognize the privilege of travel and include within our holiday budgets a donation to an NGO, for example, that is supporting the significant health challenges faced in many Pacific Island countries. And then, of course, linking this to COVID, being safe following COVID-19 protocols, so we aren't worsening the pandemic in the countries that we visit. So then finally, I think we can't be talking about well-being without considering the implications of the travel industry on the environment. Of course, many of you will be very aware of the impact of carbon emissions resulting from flights and airline travel. But also, I think there's an opportunity as travelers to be thinking about how we minimize our carbon emissions through the type of accommodation that we stay at, the type of food that we choose to eat. And of course, how do we minimize our waste and take an opportunity to reconnect with nature and be respectful through doing so. So my key takeaway for travelers is to really acknowledge the privilege of being a traveler and to place the well-being of the communities that you visit at the heart of your decision-making and the way that you behave when you travel. So travel post-pandemic or during pandemic, which is what's probably going to happen, can no longer just be about recharging and restoring your own well-being, but it must also be about the well-being of the people that you visit. And to do that needs to be a very thoughtful and mindful process, and one that begins pre-trip before you even start to travel, in terms of how you're planning, how you're researching your destination, and continues through until when you return home, in terms of how you communicate your experience and how you continue to learn and share what you learnt once you're back home. And then just finally, my focus has been on travellers, but for any of you listening who might be destination managers or destination marketers, I think there's a key message for you as well, which is how will you leverage the growing desire amongst visitors to be good travellers? I think the pandemic has really led to greater visibility of the importance of more sustainable and mindful forms of travel. So how can you leverage that shift in consumer demand that's occurring to really enhance your community's well-being? And one example of that some of you may be familiar with is the Visitor Pledge, and the Palau Pledge in particular, which is now stamped into all visitors' passports on arrival into Palau, and is an immigration requirement to sign that pledge as a visitor in order to enter Palau. And it's a pledge to the children of Palau to protect their island home. And there's various commitments in terms of what that should look like. And similarly, the Tiaki Promise in New Zealand is about acting as guardians of New Zealand when we travel. So an opportunity there, I think, as destination managers and marketers, to really think about how can you make it easier for people to be good travelers, and how can you build the brand of your destination and market your destination as a place that good travelers really want to come to. So I will stop there, but thank you so much. And I will hand back to you, Josie, to manage questions.
Oh, it's wonderful, Eliza, and so practical again about what we can do. And the thing I love about what you said is, we tend to, those of us in the aid sector tend to go to countries thinking we can save the world, but actually we might just be more useful helping to clean the church. So that's a wonderful message to take away. Open to the floor now. Anyone who would like to ask questions of Eliza, Api or Regina, or just make some comments. There's a few comments that have come through in the chat room, which we'll also get to, but anyone want to talk to the questions? And just unmute yourself if you want to say anything. This time of year, it's very informal. Just while you're thinking, I will go to one question here, which I thought was a really good one, actually, that what's the financial support available for communities and businesses in tourism to get access now, sort of post the COVID, or as you said, Eliza, I mean, we're living in the COVID. What kind of financial support? So we know there were no wage subsidies, particularly consistently so across the Pacific, except for in the Cooks. But is there other support for local tourist organisations that you know of?
It hasn't been great, Josie. There has been government support for businesses in all cases in some ways, but sometimes sometimes bigger businesses have received support, but small family-owned ones have not been eligible. Other times, for employees themselves, they've been able to access their superannuation savings, essentially. And the government, say in Fiji, has couched that as them getting a handout from the government, but it's actually their own superannuation savings. And some people now have no money left in those accounts that are supposed to be sitting there for their retirement, or to have been used for something major, rather than just to help them survive this period. So that's been a bit of a worry. So the experiences have been mixed, country by country, different approaches. Is there anything you'd add on?
I think one key area that has opened up to a lot of businesses in particular is access to easy credit and finance. And these are loans, right? Sometimes in some places the loans are subsidized, but eventually it needs to be paid off, and there's been talk, and this also came out in the recent South Pacific Tourism Research Symposium, that there needs to be more conversations around insurance schemes. There's insurance for tourists, but there should also be insurance for local workers and local businesses, to sort of build into their programs for future uncertainties. There'll be, we're well into the cyclone season now. Our friends in Palau have been affected. Our cousins in New Caledonia, they've also felt the brunt of these storms in the past couple of days. So these are things that will continue. So I guess in terms of finance, everything is reactive at the moment. It's reactive to the situation. There is no robust financial mechanism to ensure resilience.
Yeah, and thanks, Guaida Miranda from Timor-Leste for that question. That is a really important one, and that's again why we have to look at what are governments doing in these circumstances too, and we are through our research trying to learn a little bit about what might be some of the better approaches there, recognising that not all governments are in the same position when it comes to the support that can be extended.
Any other questions? Do people want to turn their mics on and speak to their questions? There's a good one here about how does this apply, or does this apply specifically to the SDGs, which of course were devised and written before COVID?
Yeah, that's come from Jules.
I think that's from Jules. Yeah, do you want to turn your phone on, Jules, your phone, your mic, or
we do have a Api and I were part of a group that ran a conference on tourism and the SDGs back in 2019, and we could link each of the SDGs to various things that are going on. It's more important as our countries linking what they're doing to the SDGs. I don't think they're using them to guide their development, except for the fact that SPTO, the Regional Tourism Organisation, has a really good sustainable tourism policy that's come through, and Vanuatu has an exemplary sustainable tourism policy if you want to see countries that are embracing this. And Vanuatu is also, of course, very good at measuring well-being and drawing on customary measures of well-being too. So I think it's a really great country to look at. They've done some interesting things to support things on the domestic scene while their borders are closed, like linkages between food produced locally and the tourism industry, thinking about agri-tourism and so forth. So I think there's some good examples from there. We absolutely could pull out specific SDGs and link them to what's been happening at the moment. But some of that too, the ecological ones, there's the danger of saying things are much better at the moment because we don't have all those international planes flying in and out with tourists. But when 40% of your revenue or 70% of your Cook Islands, of your GDP is reliant on tourism, it's also not fair for us to think that there's a no tourism future. That's not what people are asking for either, but they are asking for a bit more control over it and a way that tourism can complement their ways of life. They have talked about enjoying having their own beaches back though, being able to experience nature and a bit more because they've had more time. So that's nice to see. Thanks, Jules. Thanks for turning your camera on too. It's nice to see some of the people who are out there. Some more of you.
Feel free to turn your cameras on. We're nearly done. We're just over the hour. But Eliza, I had a quick question. Do you have any data about whether or not tourists are going to come back? Because that's the other thing. It's all very well to think about how we become better tourists, but will tourists go back?
Yeah, thank you, Josie. I'll just quickly add a comment on the SDG question first as well. I think as operators and people working within the industry, there is an opportunity there as well to think about how do we align our work with the SDGs, and that's certainly something at Good Travel we've sought to do, particularly through themed trips. So for example, women's empowerment trips that align with SDG 5 and promoting gender equality. So I think there's an avenue there to be explored further with operators as well. In terms of tourists coming back, for sure, they are coming back already. This is speaking from personal experience as opposed to data, but the majority of our clients at Good Travel are US based, and we've begun launching trips again for next year, and they are filling up very fast. There's a lot of pent-up demand for travel. So I do believe that tourism will return and is already returning, and UNWTO on their website would have some great stats around specific numbers and international arrivals and how that's changed over the past couple of years. It will be interesting though to see how trends develop, and I do think people will be traveling differently and already are traveling differently to how they did pre-pandemic. So I hope that will be a positive change in terms of the vision that we have for the tourism industry. I hope it will lead to people taking longer trips and traveling more slowly and being more mindful in the way that they travel. And that is certainly some data to demonstrate that people are, at the very least, more aware about the impact that tourism has on destinations. That's been far more in the media, I think, than it ever has before, particularly in terms of how destinations that suffered from over-tourism pre-COVID are thriving in some regards as a result of no longer having tourists. So I do think there is a general greater awareness, and hopefully that will translate into actual visitor behaviour change.
Thanks, Eliza. I do think, just to sum up here, unless anyone's got any final comments or questions, please turn your mic on and your picture. But just to do a final summary, I think what you're all saying and what we all know and what we can see ourselves is that returning to business as usual will just not be an option. And it's not just that it's not acceptable, it actually won't be possible. The landscape has changed for tourism. And I think that you talked a lot of, Regina and Api, about transferable skills. It's also the way in which tourism and this new kind of dialogue around tourism is supporting alternatives to tourism for incomes and jobs and security as well. And that kind of resilience that we're seeing in Pacific communities is something that we can learn from here in New Zealand. So it seems really important to us that we don't waste this crisis of COVID, that there is good that can come out of it. And part of it is listening very, very carefully to what it is that Pacific communities are asking us to support. And that's the thing that you've done here with this research, with your work, Eliza, as well. It's very practical. It's very clear what we can do to support. So we need to listen to that and think about how we're doing it as aid charities, but also how MFAT and donors are doing it too. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Wonderful to get a presentation, live presentation just before Christmas. And thank you to everyone for attending and making the time in this always slightly crazy time. So we will be, if it's all right with you, distributing those slides, if that's okay, with people who've been on, and also anything else that people want. We have recorded it for those that couldn't actually make it at this time. Just let us know. But otherwise, have a wonderful holiday season. Take care, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,